Look, now it's just my pleasure to introduce Professor Catrin Evans. We are moving into a rapid-fire session of our symposium. Catrin will be talking about tackling health inequalities, methods and approaches for attending to equality, diversity, and inclusion within the qualitative systematic review process, which is an area of rich and deep interest, particularly in the JBI collaboration, so that's wonderful. Just for those of you that don't know Catrin, she is Professor of Evidence-Based Healthcare based at the University of Nottingham in the UK. She is Co-Director of the Nottingham Centre for Evidence-Based Healthcare, a JBI Centre of Excellence. Professor Evans is passionate about synthesis, evidence synthesis, and is enjoying serving as a current chair of the JBI Qualitative Evidence Synthesis Methods Group. Catrin, please come to the stage and make her feel welcome.
So, good morning, everyone. It's a real joy and privilege to be here. I also feel kind of nervous and inadequate coming after the two amazing sessions we've just had, but I'll do my best. So, as Craig has said, in my talk today, I'm going to be offering some thoughts on how qualitative evidence synthesis methods and approaches can be sensitive to and help to advance health equity. So I guess, linking in with what Ruth was saying, it's about thinking of the systematic review bit, recognising all the challenges and issues that we've just sort of been made very, very aware of, but nonetheless thinking about, are there ways in which we can perhaps develop that methodology a little bit. So I'm going to start by providing a bit of context around equity and in the evidence ecosystem. And then I'm going to be in general, and then I'm going to be talking specifically about what role qualitative evidence synthesis might play in that. As part of the discussion, I'm going to be presenting the results of a small methodological study that a group of us, listed here on the slide, hopefully, have been undertaking. So that's some colleagues at the University of Nottingham and colleagues from the JBI Qualitative Methodology Group. And I'll end with some suggestions for methodological development and thoughts on how we might take the conversation further. But this is a kind of large and complicated and contested arena. And so before I start, I want to sort of acknowledge my own kind of humility in this area. I can't pretend to be an expert in EDI or some of the issues that I'm going to talk about, and I need to acknowledge my own kind of privilege that I'm very aware of across various social arenas, and also all sorts of issues that I may not be aware of. So what I'm presenting here is offered in the spirit of dialogue, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts in the Q&A. So in terms of context for this talk, as all of you know, it's coming really soon after World Evidence-Based Healthcare Day, whose theme was health equity in the evidence ecosystem. And equity is increasingly being recognised as a crucial lens through which we need to view our collective endeavours. So when thinking about this presentation, I thought probably before I start, I need to just quickly define what I mean by equity and the linked concepts of diversity and inclusion. But this would have been quite dry and boring, so I was really very happy to find a video that is produced by an academic colleague who some of you I think here know very well, Dr Lynn Hendricks from Stellenbosch University in South Africa, who is doing some amazing work on creative approaches to evidence synthesis. And she spoke, actually, she was one of the panelists in the World Evidence-Based Healthcare webinar, so hopefully all of you will know her. Anyway, she has produced a lovely video that kind of captures everything that I would have wanted to say. And she's given me permission to share this with you today, but obviously I have to acknowledge that it's her video, not mine. So thank you very much to Lynn. So I'll just play this now and hope that it works. Okay. What a wonderful video. So thank you again to Lynn for letting me share that. So now I'm just going to think a little bit more, what does equity, diversity and inclusion mean for us within the evidence ecosystem? So the images here on this slide depicting equity, equality, justice and reality are probably very, very familiar to all of you. I know this sort of picture or something similar to it is used a lot. So the question I have for us today actually is, where do we stand in this picture? So which side of the fence are we on? I'd like to suggest, I know probably for myself, that as academics, researchers or policymakers interested in health, depending on our position and our privilege, we may well be in the game or in the arena. Perhaps we're really important and therefore we're one of the players or maybe even the captain. Maybe we're just in the crowd, hoping and longing that our presence and our chants can influence the outcome. So in our various positions in the arena, we are looking at the fence. But what do we see? Do we see a head, a trunk, a hand, or do we see people? And what I'm trying to get at is that in this presentation, I'm going to be thinking about how our own position in this evidence ecosystem and the practices that we adopt will influence what is visible or invisible, what's heard and not heard, and what kind of picture emerges. And that how and what we see is also influenced by those around us. So this relates to who is in our team and who we're working with, so that's diversity. And are we making space to listen and for everyone's voices to be heard? So that relates to inclusion. So how do we make sense of some of this in relation to evidence synthesis specifically? Well, I'm sure many of you are very aware that there's been lots of work going on in this area for just over a decade, really, thinking about how we can attend to equity in evidence synthesis. And various groups of people have been working on this. So, for example, I'm sure you're aware of the PRISMA Equity Extension, which was developed and published in 2012, which is all about prompting review teams to start thinking about equity right at the beginning of the review, defining it, thinking about populations that they may need to look at specifically, and thinking about the sort of analyses and outcomes that may be relevant for their reviews. Now, as you all know, that equity extension is primarily targeted to quantitative reviews in one form or the other. One of the other ways that has been sort of widely used in connection from the same team that was working on the PRISMA Equity Extension is the Progress Plus framework. Progress Plus is an acronym that lists out certain characteristics that you can see here on the slide that can form axes of advantage or disadvantage, and that will intersect with each other in various ways, potentially to influence outcomes. And the use of this framework within reviews, right at the beginning and throughout the analyses, can be a very useful way of helping review teams think about how they're sort of reporting on the samples of their underpinning studies and things like, which groups have been represented or not represented, and whether or not subgroup analyses need to be undertaken. So the PRISMA Equity Extension and Progress Plus and various other guidance chapters, for example, the Cochrane Handbook has got a whole chapter on equity that's been around for a long time. But like our last speaker, sorry, the name just went, Maureen, was just saying, so these tools and these methods and the approaches and the interest has been there for a long time, but how are we actually doing in relation to operationalising this into our reviews? So what became very evident very quickly during COVID, as Maureen said, was that we're not currently doing this very well. So policymakers are reporting that the lack of equity-related analyses and information in the reviews limits their usefulness for decision-making. And that became really evident and urgent during the COVID pandemic. And that has sparked a whole number of methodological investigations that are demonstrating again and again that quantitative reviews, which is where most of them have been done, are paying insufficient, if any, attention to equity currently. So I'm going to turn now to thinking about qualitative reviews, because that's the kind of focus of this talk. But when people have been thinking about the limitations in relation to equity that are being sort of highlighted in relation to quantitative reviews and their usefulness for decision making, one of the ways in which one of the main suggestions that people are making is, okay, well, we need to do qualitative reviews to add in greater insight into sort of context and understanding of social processes, social norms, why interventions may or may not be working, or to help explain the equity-related mechanisms of particular intervention strategies. So, the sort of one of the solutions is let's do more qualitative reviews to help add that context. And that is really valuable and really important. And as a qualitative researcher, I love that and welcome it. However, not all qualitative systematic reviews are done as part of an adjunct to or to enhance or explain intervention reviews. We have a lot of qualitative reviews that are being undertaken as important inquiries in their own right. And we can't sort of assume that those reviews are somehow value-free and, just because they're looking at experiences, that they are also thinking about equity, because that doesn't happen by itself unless we attend very consciously to thinking about what that might mean. So some qualitative reviews, even if they're undertaken as an inquiry in their own right, of course, have an equity-related focus and incorporate a lot of aspects of sensitivity to equity by looking at marginalised groups or doing intersectional analyses. A lot of qualitative reviews, however, are framed in a more generic or universal way. So they might be, for example, what were nurses' experiences of, working during the pandemic? Those kind of universal or generically framed reviews may well have a really important equity dimension to them, but unless we sort of think about how can we make that explicit, we may be missing important sort of aspects of people's experience and outcomes. So what our group did was we undertook a methodological scoping review, looking at, so the question we were asking is, what are the ways in which qualitative systematic review teams are addressing health equity, diversity and inclusion in the process of conducting and reporting qualitative systematic reviews. And initially we focused just on the JBI approach, reviews that have used the JBI approach, because we had very limited time and money, and we are the JBI Qualitative Methodology Group. So we've kind of started there, but I've got absolutely no reason to think that our findings that I'm going to share with you in a minute would be radically different, even with other review types. So what we did was we undertook a methodological inquiry, just taking a one-year snapshot and looking at all published JBI qualitative systematic reviews that have followed the full JBI approach, so right through to using Conqual to assess confidence in the synthesized findings. We just did a very limited search of Medline and Sinal to get a reasonable sample. And then we undertook data extraction and analysis based on an adaptation of a framework that was published in 2022 by Omar Dewida and colleagues from Canada, where a lot of this work has been sort of pioneered. And they had published a paper, the reference is here at the bottom, issuing guidance to policymakers about how they should be considering embedding equity into systematic reviews at every stage. And they split it into sort of 8 key domains, so engaging stakeholders, so how are knowledge users and end users and communities and consumers being involved, and in which stages of the review. How was the review team composed? What were its values, assumptions, working dynamics, and how was that review team reflecting on its own processes and how that might be influencing the review? So that's around reflexivity. Were the reviews identifying relevant populations and disaggregating those? Were they conducting searches in a way that might pick up non-traditional sources of knowledge and perhaps non-English language sources? And then how was the data being reported in relation to the Progress Plus characteristics, and how were those characteristics being kind of embedded into the analyses of the review? And then thinking about how or whether the review teams are sort of thinking about transferability and applicability to different population groups. So we used that framework. So we did a sort of framework synthesis of the reviews that we found. And I have to say here that, of course, this is all offered here without any sort of judgment at all. It includes my reviews. It includes, and we know also that what people report in their published reviews is not always what really happened. We know that there are journal word counts and limits on what we can actually say and explain. So I'm totally aware of that and find that a real problem myself. But nonetheless, so in that 1 year sample, we found 43 reviews published in the JBI journal, but also lots and lots of other journals. And so I'm just giving you a few very brief headline findings here, really, and I'm not going to unpick or unpack everything. But you can see some interesting kind of areas here which might make us sort of pause for thought about our own practices. So in terms of engagement with communities and stakeholders, only 1 out of those 43 reviews reported any kind of engagement. Now, they may well have done that, but we don't know. It was not part of the discussion of the review. In terms of reflection on team values and composition, so this is about reflexivity, really, which we know in qualitative research, in fact, in all research, should be really important. Only 8 out of those 43 reviews provided any information at all about the composition of the review team. 4 provided a bit more information about their sort of background. So, the team were a nurse and a midwife and an academic, but didn't move on to then say, well, what does that mean for the analysis or how the team worked, or just descriptive. And then 3 did a bit more of a sort of reflexive critical analysis, thinking about how their own assumptions were addressed. Did they do bracketing? Did they do any other sort of process? How was it taken through the whole review process to come up with their findings? Okay. So in terms of the next domain, which was, how were populations perhaps experiencing inequalities being recognised or addressed? The majority, so 84% of the reviews that we looked at, had a global or generic focus. So, you can't necessarily then draw conclusions about particular areas that may be experiencing disadvantages or issues. Likewise, in terms of the population focus, so 6 cited an equity-related rationale for why they have chosen that particular population. But otherwise, it was usually sort of patients or health workers. Or in terms of sources of evidence, 1/3 of the reviews did look at non-English language databases, and the majority looked at grey literature sources. Then, in relation to collecting data for equity, this is thinking about, the samples of our underpinning studies in the reviews, thinking about and being able to report on how they have characterised their populations. So obviously you can only report on what's there, and we don't know whether there was more detail there but it wasn't reported, or whether it's just that it wasn't reported in the primary studies, or in the review, sorry. So 3 reported on, so 16 reviews mentioned age characteristics of their samples, 10 reported something in relation to sex or gender, 3 reported on ethnicity or race, and 1 reported on socioeconomic status. But other than that, the majority were sort of, the samples were not well characterised. Okay. In terms of critical appraisal, so the sort of analysis and synthesis approaches, the majority of the reviews recognise limitations relating to reflexivity and transparency in the underpinning studies, and where relevant, synthesised findings were downgraded in terms of the Conqual assessment. So there's a sort of recognition there of the importance of that aspect. And in terms of the actual synthesis approach, 10 of the reviews did demonstrate an element of intersectional or sort of critical approaches, recognising issues of power or representation within their sort of within the way they develop their categories or synthesise findings. And most of the reviews included a reflection on kind of limitations of the evidence and how that may or may not be transferable or applicable, noting kind of gaps in the evidence as well. So, okay, so that was like a brief run through of what we found from our little snapshot of looking at, existing qualitative systematic reviews. And I think what we are sort of concluding at the moment, although it would be really great to have a bit more discussion with you all, is that, I think there is room for more explicit consideration of EDI at every stage of our review processes. And this is particularly important in 2 areas. So one, in terms of our own team values and practices, because the review team, how it works, who's there, who's not there, will influence the review question, the purpose, the focus, the process, and of course the whole component of knowledge translation. So this relates to knowledge user, community, consumer engagement, and to reflexivity within the review process. And then also in terms of review methods and reporting, perhaps we can be more explicit about searching in non-traditional ways, reporting the data on the progress plus characteristics if it's there, and thinking about how we can do intersectional analyses if and kind of where relevant. So this is my last slide. So in conclusion, qualitative evidence synthesis is an important part of the evidence ecosystem, and they can be a really powerful tool for illuminating experiences, social processes, intervention mechanisms, human experiences. We know that. Qualitative evidence synthesis as a synthesis product inevitably amplifies the perspectives and experiences of the group of studies that we're reporting on. So I think that's really important to kind of think about and be aware of in terms of, whose voice, whose perspective is it amplifying, what's the dominant picture, but then to think about what's not being reported. Have we noticed it? Have we seen it? Maybe it was there and we didn't see it. Whose voice didn't we hear? And if we didn't hear it, maybe that's then the area for more research in the future. So I'd like to just conclude with thinking that perhaps We do need more methodological research on how we might be able to do this better in our evidence syntheses, and also thinking about reporting on some of these equity or EDI related issues in our reporting guidance, because currently the NTREC reporting guidance for qualitative evidence synthesis doesn't have anything at all about sort of EDI related issues, and the methods guidance is quite quiet on this as well across the board, across all the sort of evidence groups for qualitative review specifically. So this is an area where we might want to do some more development together, hopefully. So thank you, that's it from me. I have no idea what the time is, so I'm blind.
Oh, no, we've got ages.
Oh, okay,
so feel
right.
free people to keep loading some of your questions into the app.
Okay.
And thanks for such a great talk. Like, these are important questions we need to be asking and thinking through. Start you off on an easy question, okay? Given that you've had a bit of an exposure and experience here and that you've been thinking this through for yourself, how would somebody who's familiar with qualitative evidence synthesis but never taken an EDI lens, how would they get started?
That is a really good question. I think probably just echoing what our two other wonderful speakers have said this morning. I think the starting point is always the review question, isn't it? That's what we teach our students. You know, we get that right and everything else will be right. And I think the review question, if we can develop that together with our, our knowledge users, our communities, if that is a sort of community-led and collaborative process, and we have those discussions about what is the question and how does equity come into that right at the beginning, then I think that will set you off pretty well on the rest of the process. But,
so what would you say to someone who said, I'd like to do that, but I just don't have the time to engage?
Yeah, I think that's a real issue, and I'm sure that is one of the reasons why we found very low reporting anyway of knowledge user involvement. It's probably, some of these reviews are probably PhD student reviews. I mean, I've done reviews where I try now really hard to do, very participatory reviews, but haven't always had, you just don't always have the time or the funding. But I do think it comes back to the issue of where there's a will, there's a way. It's not, especially for those of us who are working perhaps in practice or have come from practice or working with communities, there's always some way of engaging knowledge users in one way or the other, but you need to want to do it, and the guidance needs to support people to do it, because particularly then if it's relatively newer researchers or novice researchers, they turn to our guidance, and if we're not saying this is what you need to do, then they won't necessarily know to do it. So the responsibility lies with us in the development of our guidance as well, I think.
You also touched quite a bit on reflexivity. The role of research.
You're going to ask me a horrible methodological question.
Indeed. Why don't we see more evidence of reflexivity in qualitative evidence synthesis?
I would love to put that question out to the audience. Why don't we see more reflexivity in qualitative evidence synthesis? I mean, it's really, it is interesting because all of the critical appraisal tools for appraising the methodological quality of our primary qualitative research include questions around reflexivity and power and transparency within the review process. So the JBI tool, pushes us to think carefully about the researcher identity and, how they've engaged with the research process, and the CASP tool does, and all of the others, almost all of them do. And yet we're not doing it ourselves or not reporting it as in our qualitative systematic review. So I think that is an area where we probably, again, we need to do more. I don't know why we're not doing it. One of the reasons I think might be why we're not seeing it. We may well be doing it, but we're not seeing it. It comes back to perhaps to journal word limits, where You're already shoehorning all that lovely rich detail into 3,000 words, and you just can't afford another 300 words on your lovely reflexive process that you might well have done, but you have to sort of delete that bit out of your manuscript. So there may be a lot more happening than we see, but then I think it's a challenge to the journal editors to make space for that, and that's not just for qualitative reviews either. I think that's really important for all reviews.
That ties in nicely with Ruth's comment about we all actually have bias. We should just probably be honest about it. We're not quite as pure as we want. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Catrin once more.
Thank you.